The dawn broke crimson over the harbour of Portobello in the year 1698, and with it came the black flag that had terrorized every coast from Cartagena to Havana. Captain Erasmus Blackwood's ship, the Vengeful Serpent, appeared through the morning haze like a spectre summoned from nightmare itself. His reputation preceded him by months. 23 merchant vessels plundered. 4 Spanish galleons sent to the ocean floor, countless sailors left to drown or worse. The mere whisper of his name emptied taverns and sent port authorities scrambling for their fastest couriers. He showed no mercy, took no prisoners who couldn't pay ransom. And his crew, it was said, drank the blood of their enemies, mixed with rum, under the full moon. Governor Don Alfonso de Mendoza watched from the fortress walls as the 3-masted brigantine glided into the bay with unnatural confidence, her guns run out, her decks swarming with cutlass-wielding devils. Behind him, soldiers loaded muskets with trembling hands, while priests muttered prayers to Santiago and the Virgin. The town's wealthiest merchants had already fled inland with whatever gold they could carry, leaving their warehouses and counting houses to whatever fate Blackwood would deliver. If you're following this tale from across the seas, drop your city in the comments and join our crew of story seekers. But something strange happened that morning in Portobello. As the Vengeful Serpent drew within cannon range and the fortress gunners awaited the order to fire, a longboat was lowered from Blackwood's ship. In it sat only 3 men, the captain himself, his quartermaster, and a single rower. No weapons visible save the cutlasses at their belts. Don Alfonso squinted through his brass spyglass, searching for the trick, the hidden stratagem that would explain this apparent madness. A pirate captain rowing directly into a fortified Spanish harbour with barely a guard. The longboat reached the stone quay beneath the fortress. Blackwood climbed the water-slick steps with the casual grace of a man ascending to his own throne rather than walking into the den of his enemies. He was tall, burned dark by equatorial sun, with grey streaking through hair tied back in the sailor's fashion. A scar bisected his left eyebrow, and his coat, once fine burgundy velvet, now salt-stained and patched, bore the unmistakable marks of a gentleman gone to seed, or perhaps something more calculated. "I wish to speak with the governor," Blackwood announced to the stunned soldiers who surrounded him with musket barrels. "Tell Don Alfonso that I bring intelligence from Jamaica, intelligence he'll want to hear before he wastes good powder trying to sink my ship." The words were delivered in perfect Castilian Spanish, not the broken pidgin most pirates managed. This alone gave the soldiers pause. One ran to fetch the captain of the guard, while the others kept their weapons trained on the pirate's chest. Blackwood waited with the patient stillness of a man who had played this game before. In the governor's chambers, Don Alfonso paced before the wide windows overlooking the harbour. The Vengeful Serpent sat at anchor, her crew visible on deck, but making no preparations for assault. The whole situation reeked of theatre, of some performance whose script he had not been given. When Blackwood was finally ushered in, still armed, which was itself unusual, the governor studied him with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 30 years in colonial administration by reading the subtle languages of power. "You have courage or madness, Captain Blackwood," Don Alfonso said. "I cannot yet determine which." "Neither, Your Excellency. I have information, and a proposal that serves both our interests." Blackwood produced a sealed letter from inside his coat. The wax bore a signet that made the governor's breath catch. The royal seal of Spain, authenticated with the proper subsidiary marks of the Council of the Indies. The letter, which Don Alfonso read 3 times with increasing incredulity, transformed the morning's reality. It bore instructions from Madrid itself, dated 8 months prior, and countersigned by the Viceroy in Cartagena. Captain Erasmus Blackwood, formerly of His Majesty's Navy of England, had entered Spanish service as a privateer with one specific mandate: to hunt and destroy the French pirates and buccaneers who had been raiding Spanish treasure fleets with impunity for the past 5 years. Every Spanish ship he had reportedly sunk had been carrying contraband or had captains suspected of collaboration with French interests. Every merchant vessel he had plundered belonged to French-backed trading companies operating illegally in Spanish waters. The blood he had spilled was French blood, or the blood of those who sold Spanish secrets to France. "The council requires that my cover remain absolute," Blackwood explained, as the governor set down the letter with shaking hands. "If the French buccaneers discover I am hunting them specifically, they will scatter to ports beyond our reach. If the English Navy learns I have taken Spanish commission, my head will decorate a pike in Port Royal. So I must remain the devil all nations fear equally. I must be the pirate that everyone wants dead." "And what do you want from Portobello?" Don Alfonso managed. "Your harbor patrol reports that the French pirate Claude Montrose is planning to raid the mule trains coming down from the silver mines. I need to find him first. I need your scouts' intelligence on his movements. And I need your garrison to look the other way when I sail from here fully provisioned. In exchange, I will deliver you Montrose's head and his entire treasure hoard, minus my crew's agreed share." The governor stared at this man, who wore infamy like a cloak, but spoke with the calculated precision of a diplomat. "And if I refuse?" Blackwood smiled without warmth. "Then Montrose takes your silver, and you explain to the viceroy why you failed to utilize an asset Madrid specifically placed in these waters. The letter mentions my commission includes authority to requisition colonial cooperation. I prefer willing allies, Don Alfonso. They tend to keep secrets better." Over the next 4 days, while the citizens of Portobello whispered fearfully about the pirate ship at anchor and why the governor had not attacked it, Blackwood met quietly with the garrison's intelligence officers in rooms deep within the fortress. Maps were spread, positions marked, passwords exchanged. The scouts reported that Montrose's fleet, 3 ships and 200 men, was hiding in a cove 30 miles north, preparing to strike the moment the silver convoy left the mining camp. "He has a spy in your garrison," Blackwood said flatly, studying the map. "Someone who knows the convoy schedules and routes. Find that spy, or Montrose will always be one move ahead." The governor's men worked through the night with methods Blackwood did not inquire about. By dawn, they had found their traitor, a junior officer whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable to French gold. His confession, extracted in the fortress dungeon, provided the final pieces Blackwood needed: the recognition signals Montrose's fleet used, the names of his captains, and the location of his supply caches on the smaller islands. Blackwood left Portobello just as mysteriously as he had arrived, his ship laden with fresh water, salted meat, and barrels of the garrison's best gunpowder. To any observer, it appeared the pirate had extorted tribute from the intimidated Spaniards. In truth, he had been given everything necessary to execute his hunt. The Vengeful Serpent was a ship built for speed over cargo capacity, and Blackwood knew her capabilities as intimately as a musician knows his instrument. She could outsail anything her size and outgun anything faster. His crew of 70 men represented the dregs of every nation: English deserters, Spanish criminals, Portuguese sailors who had chosen the account over execution, Dutch gunners who had lost fingers to frostbite in Arctic whaling ships. They were bound together by shared greed and the certain knowledge that their captain never failed to find prey. What none of them knew was the true nature of their captain's loyalties. To them, Blackwood was exactly what he appeared: a brilliant predator who hunted the shipping lanes with surgical precision, who divided plunder fairly, and who possessed an uncanny ability to know which ships carried the richest cargo. They did not question how he chose his targets. They only counted their shares. Jonas Reed, the quartermaster, was perhaps the only man aboard who suspected something deeper. He had sailed with Blackwood for 3 years, through storms and battles, and had noticed patterns the others missed. The captain sometimes consulted letters that arrived via mysterious couriers in various ports. He occasionally spared ships that by all logic should have been plundered, and his hatred of the French seemed personal in a way that transcended ordinary pirate opportunism. "What are we hunting this time?" Reed asked, as they stood together at the stern rail, watching Portobello diminish behind them. "Claude Montrose," Blackwood replied, "the French dog who thinks he's clever enough to steal Spanish silver under the Viceroy's nose. Montrose commands 3 ships to our 1. His crews are veterans of the Tortuga Brotherhood. This isn't a merchant vessel we can rake with chain shot and board before they know what's happening." Blackwood turned to face his quartermaster, and in his eyes Reed saw something that went beyond pirate cunning. It was the cold calculation of a naval strategist. "Then we won't fight fair, we'll fight smart. Montrose expects the Spanish garrison to escort that silver convoy with soldiers and muskets. He doesn't expect us." They sailed north through waters that glittered like hammered silver under the Caribbean sun. The crew went about their work with the easy efficiency of men who had survived by trusting their routines, maintaining weapons, checking powder stores, watching the horizon for sails. The ship's cook, a one-eyed Portuguese named Silva, prepared stews from salted turtle meat and sang songs about Lisbon, in a voice that carried through the heat. The gunners cleaned their cannons and practiced their firing drills until they could load and fire 3 times in 5 minutes. Blackwood spent hours in his cabin studying the intelligence Don Alfonso had provided. Montrose was predictable in his unpredictability. He liked to strike at dawn or dusk when visibility favored surprise, preferred to scatter his fleet and converge from multiple directions, always kept his fastest ship as an escape route if the battle turned against him. These were sound tactics for a pirate, but they contained exploitable patterns for someone who understood naval warfare at a deeper level. The cove where Montrose hid his fleet was a perfect natural harbor, protected by reefs that would tear the bottom from any ship whose captain did not know the channel. Blackwood approached it at midnight under reduced sail, using only the faint starlight to navigate. He had obtained exact charts from the Spanish scouts, and more importantly, he had the password that would allow him to pass through Montrose's outer picket ships. The vengeful serpent glided through the darkness like her namesake. When the challenge came from a lookout on Montrose's sloop Liberté, Blackwood responded with the French recognition signal, 3 lantern flashes, and the verbal countersign the captured spy had provided. The guard ship let them pass, assuming they were one of Montrose's auxiliary vessels returning from a scouting mission. They anchored just inside the cove mouth as false dawn began to pale the eastern sky. Through his spyglass, Blackwood could see all 3 of Montrose's ships, the Liberté, the Sans Merci, and the flagship Aigle Noir. Crews were still sleeping in hammocks below decks. Only the watch stood ready, and they were focused outward toward the sea, not expecting danger from within their own anchorage. "Load the cannons with chain shot and grape shot alternating," Blackwood ordered quietly. "We'll sweep the Sans Merci's rigging first, cripple her so she can't maneuver. Then we turn on the Aigle Noir. The Liberté is small enough to board if she tries to run." Reed executed the orders without question, though his face showed doubt. They were about to attack 3 ships simultaneously while their crews were below decks and largely asleep. It was not the code of pirate warfare. Unwritten rules held that battles should be between willing combatants, that surprise attacks on anchored vessels belonged to Navy tactics, not the brotherhood of the account. But Blackwood had never truly been one of them. Reed understood now. Whatever game the captain was playing, it operated by different rules. The first broadside roared across the still water of the cove at precisely the moment when dawnlight made accurate gunnery possible, but before full daylight would have alerted the French crews. The vengeful Serpent's port cannons sent chain shot screaming through the Sans Merci's rigging, shredding sails and cutting through masts. The starboard guns raked the Aigle Noir's deck with grape shot that killed a dozen men before they understood they were under attack. Chaos erupted across Montrose's fleet. Men poured up from below decks, many without weapons, some without clothes. The Sans Merci was already listing, her mainmast broken and dragging in the water like a fallen tree. The Aigle Noir attempted to return fire, but her gunners were disorganized, and their shots went wide, splashing harmlessly into the cove. Blackwood maneuvered the vengeful Serpent with brilliant precision, using the morning wind to position himself where he could fire on multiple targets while minimizing his own exposure. His gunners reloaded with the speed that came from endless drilling, sending another devastating broadside into the French flagship's hull. Wood exploded inward, and screams echoed across the water. The Liberté attempted to flee, her captain realizing the battle was lost and prioritizing survival over glory. But Blackwood had anticipated this. He had positioned his ship perfectly to block the only deep water channel out of the cove. The Liberté would have to either surrender or run aground on the reefs. She chose surrender, her captain hauling down the French colors and raising a white flag. The Sans Merci was already sinking, her crew abandoning ship and swimming desperately for shore, which left only the Aigle Noir and Claude Montrose himself. Blackwood could see the French pirate on the quarterdeck of his flagship, a tall figure in a plumed hat who was bellowing orders and trying to organize a coherent defense. Montrose was no coward. He had earned his reputation through years of successful raids and brutal efficiency. But he had never faced someone like Blackwood, someone who thought like an admiral rather than a pirate. The vengeful Serpent closed to boarding range, and Blackwood led his crew across the gap in a wave of violence. Steel met steel in the grey morning light. Pistol shots cracked, and men screamed and fell. The Spanish intelligence had been correct about one thing. Montrose's crews were veterans, hardened fighters who sold their lives dearly, but they were disorganized and demoralized from the surprise attack. While Blackwood's men fought with the confidence of those who knew their captain's plans always succeeded. Blackwood fought his way toward Montrose with the single-minded purpose of a hunting wolf. His cutlass work was precise rather than wild, the measured strokes of a trained swordsman rather than a brawler. When he finally faced the French pirate across the blood-slicked deck, Montrose's eyes widened with recognition. "You," Montrose spat in French. "Blackwood, I should have known." "You should have stayed in Tortuga," Blackwood replied in the same language. "The Spanish have longer memories than you thought." They fought on the quarterdeck, while around them the battleground toward its inevitable conclusion. Montrose was skilled, but desperation made him reckless. Blackwood was patient, conserving energy, waiting for the opening that always came when an opponent fought with emotion rather than calculation. When Montrose overextended on a lunge, Blackwood's blade took him through the heart with surgical accuracy. The French pirate dropped to his knees, blood spreading across his linen shirt. "Who do you serve?" he whispered. "Everyone thinks you're just another pirate, but I've seen how you work. You're too careful, too precise. Who bought you?" "Spain," Blackwood said simply, "has been paying me for 2 years. Every French pirate I've killed, every buccaneer fleet I've scattered, all of it sanctioned by the Viceroy. They wanted someone who could move in your world without suspicion." Montrose coughed blood and laughed bitterly. "So the devil himself was a Spanish dog all along. When the Brotherhood learns of this—" "They won't," Blackwood interrupted, "because I'll tell them I killed you over disputed treasure. The Brotherhood will believe that. Pirates always believe stories about greed." Montrose died with that knowledge, and Blackwood felt nothing. He had killed many men in his career, first as a Royal Navy lieutenant, then as a Spanish privateer masquerading as a pirate. Each death had been a tactical necessity, a step toward larger objectives. He did not lose sleep over them. The remaining French crew surrendered once they saw their captain fall. Blackwood had them herded into the Aigle Noir's hold, while his men began the methodical work of claiming prize. The ships held considerable wealth, gold and silver taken from previous raids, fine goods stolen from merchant vessels, even some gems that had been looted from a Spanish church. All of it would be divided according to the agreement Blackwood had with Madrid. 1/3 to his crew to maintain their loyalty and silence, 1/3 to the Spanish crown, and 1/3 to Blackwood himself. But there was something else in Montrose's cabin that made Blackwood's blood run cold. A letter, sealed but not yet sent, addressed to the French colonial governor in Martinique. He broke the seal and read words that confirmed his deepest suspicions. Montrose had been preparing to reveal Blackwood's true allegiance to every pirate haven in the Caribbean. The Frenchman had been gathering evidence, compiling testimonies from survivors of Blackwood's raids, documenting the suspicious patterns. "He knew," Reed said quietly, reading over Blackwood's shoulder, "or he suspected enough to be dangerous. And now he's dead. And this letter will never be sent." Blackwood threw the parchment into the brazier that heated Montrose's cabin, watching it curl and blacken. "Find anything else like this. Burn it all." They spent 2 days salvaging what they could from the French fleet before scuttling the damaged ships. The Liberté they kept as a prize, planning to sell her in a neutral port. The surviving French crew were given the choice: swear to sail under Blackwood's flag and never speak of what had happened, or be marooned on a barren island with minimal provisions. Most chose to swear, understanding that a pirate's oath meant nothing, but that immediate survival required the appearance of loyalty. The return to Portobello was triumphant. Blackwood delivered Montrose's head preserved in a barrel of brine, along with chests of recovered Spanish treasure that the Frenchman had previously stolen. Don Alfonso received him in the fortress with barely concealed relief, mixed with distaste. The governor understood the necessity of men like Blackwood, but did not enjoy being complicit in such moral ambiguity. "Madrid will be pleased," Don Alfonso said as they stood alone in his chambers, the pirate's head sitting in its barrel on the desk between them like some grotesque reminder of their collaboration. "You have eliminated a significant threat to our treasure fleets. And the Brotherhood of the Coast will believe I killed him for his gold," Blackwood replied. "My reputation remains intact, perhaps more fearsome than before." "Does it trouble you, living this double life, being hated by all nations while secretly serving one?" Blackwood poured himself wine from the governor's decanter, a liberty he took because his commission technically gave him authority equal to a Spanish naval captain. "I sleep well enough. I was never suited for the politics of naval promotion. Too many admirals' sons ahead of me, too little wealth to buy my way up. Spain offered me something England never would, the freedom to wage war as I see fit, without the constraints of formal tactics and diplomatic niceties, and the payment is generous. And when the war ends, when peace is eventually signed between our nations and France, what becomes of Captain Blackwood then?" It was a question Blackwood had asked himself many times in the quiet hours of the middle watch, when the sea was dark and the stars overhead were the only witnesses to his thoughts. "Then I suppose I become the very thing I have pretended to be. An actual pirate, hunted by all nations, trusted by none. Or perhaps I simply vanish, sail to the East Indies or the African coast and reinvent myself again. A lonely fate for a man. Lonelier than being hanged for piracy? I've made my choices, Don Alfonso. We all have." The governor watched this complicated man and wondered at the mechanisms of empire that created such creatures. Men who served purposes while being denied recognition, who lived outside honor while theoretically defending it. "Your next assignment comes from Cartagena. There is an English pirate named William Sharp who has been raiding our coastal settlements. The viceroy wants him dealt with." "An Englishman?" Blackwood's expression darkened. "That may prove awkward if he recognizes me from my Navy days. Then ensure he does not live long enough to share such recognition." Over the following months, rumors spread through every pirate haven from Jamaica to Tortuga about Captain Blackwood's growing brutality. He had sunk 2 English privateers in a battle off Hispaniola, killed their crews to the last man, and burned their ships to the waterline. He had raided a Dutch trading post and left no survivors to tell the tale. His ship appeared like a phantom wherever treasure was moving, and increasingly his attacks seemed random, inexplicable by the normal logic of pirate profit. What the Brotherhood did not know was that each target had been specifically selected by Spanish intelligence. The English privateers had been conducting illegal surveys of Spanish fortifications. The Dutch trading post had been a front for smuggling weapons to indigenous tribes who resisted Spanish control. Every seemingly random act of violence served a larger strategic purpose, and every death brought Blackwood closer to both fortune and damnation. Jonas Reed began to drink more heavily than usual. He had pieced together enough fragments of truth to understand that they were not true pirates, that their captain was something more dangerous and more compromised. But Reed had his own reasons for not speaking up. He had killed a man in Plymouth and fled England under sentence of death. Blackwood's ship offered him sanctuary and wealth, even if it came wrapped in moral corruption. "How long can we keep this going?" Reed asked one night as they shared a bottle in Blackwood's cabin, the lantern swaying with the ship's gentle roll. "How long before someone in the Brotherhood realizes the pattern? We only ever attack French and English targets. We never touch Spanish treasure ships, even when they're poorly defended. We attacked that Spanish merchant 3 months ago," Blackwood pointed out. "The one carrying contraband for a French trading company. I read the manifests after we took her. She was barely Spanish, except for her flag." Blackwood studied his quartermaster across the desk, weighing how much truth to share. "What would you have me do, Reed? Confess to the Brotherhood that I'm a Spanish privateer? I'd be dead within a week, hunted by every pirate in the Caribbean. And what happens when Spain no longer needs you, when the political situation changes and suddenly you become inconvenient? Do you think Madrid will honor your service, or will they sacrifice you to diplomatic expediency?" "I have insurance," Blackwood said quietly. "Letters, documents, proof of my commission, and everything I've done in Spanish service, safely hidden where they'll be found if I die unexpectedly. Spain knows that if they betray me, their colonial administrators will be exposed as having employed pirates against European rivals. The scandal would be considerable." Reed nodded slowly, understanding the layers of leverage and counter-leverage that kept this entire arrangement functioning. "So we're all prisoners of these secrets. You, me, the governors who meet with you, the Spanish agents who pass you intelligence. Prisoners perhaps, but well-fed ones." The game might have continued indefinitely, with Blackwood becoming ever more feared while secretly serving Spanish interests, had it not been for events beyond his control. In April of 1701, King Carlos II of Spain died without an heir, and the War of Spanish Succession erupted across Europe. Alliances shifted like sand in a storm. France and Spain became allies overnight, while England and the Netherlands joined against them. The neat categories of enemy and friend that had governed Blackwood's mission dissolved into diplomatic chaos. His Spanish handlers sent him confused and contradictory orders. He was to continue hunting pirates but avoid French vessels unless they attacked him first. He was to raid English and Dutch shipping, but not so aggressively that it would draw a naval response. The clarity that had defined his purpose evaporated, replaced by political hedging and bureaucratic cowardice. "They're abandoning us," Reed said when he read the latest dispatches. "They won't say it directly, but they're cutting us loose." Blackwood knew his quartermaster was right. The strategic utility of a pirate hunting other pirates had made sense when France was the enemy. But now Spain needed French cooperation against England, and an English pirate working for Spain, even one as useful as Blackwood, became an embarrassing complication rather than an asset. The final confirmation came from an unexpected source. A Portuguese merchant captain they intercepted off the Pearl Islands carried news from Europe. The Spanish court had issued letters of marque to several French privateers, including 2 men Blackwood had previously hunted. The English pirate William Sharp, whom Blackwood had been ordered to kill, had received a pardon from the governor of Jamaica and was now sailing legally as an English privateer. The entire complicated structure of allegiances and enemies that had given purpose to Blackwood's double life had been reshuffled by men in distant European courts who cared nothing for the consequences their decisions created in the Caribbean. "What do we do now?" Reed asked. It was the question the entire crew was silently wondering. They had followed Blackwood through battles and storms, trusting his judgment even when they did not fully understand his strategies. Blackwood stood at the stern rail, watching the sun set over the endless blue expanse of the Caribbean. He thought of the naval officer he had been once, before honor had been revealed as merely another currency to be traded by those with sufficient power. He thought of Don Alfonso and the other Spanish officials who had used him and would now disavow him to protect their political positions. He thought of the men he had killed, both guilty and innocent, in service of a cause that had just proven itself to be built on sand. "We become what everyone already believes us to be," he said finally. "Real pirates. No more secret allegiances, no more hidden purposes. We hunt whatever we want, take what we need, and answer to no nation." The crew received this declaration with mixed feelings. Some were relieved. At least now the rules were clear and they would not have to wonder whether their captain was operating on hidden orders. Others were worried, knowing that true pirates eventually ended on gallows or at the bottom of the sea. But all agreed to follow Blackwood, because in the end he had never failed to provide them with plunder and had never betrayed them, even if he had betrayed nations. For 2 years they raided indiscriminately. Spanish, French, English, Dutch, all flags were equal prey. The vengeful serpent became the nightmare that the legends had always claimed, a ship that appeared without warning and showed no mercy. Blackwood's tactical brilliance served him just as well in true piracy as it had in sanctioned hunting. He accumulated considerable wealth, hiding caches of treasure on various islands throughout the Caribbean, never keeping too much aboard ship in case disaster struck. But the new life came with new complications. The British Navy, freed from European entanglements as the war wound down, turned its attention to suppressing piracy in the Caribbean. Dedicated pirate hunting vessels began patrolling the major trade routes, and the old safe havens like Tortuga fell under increased military pressure. The golden age of piracy that had flourished during the chaos of war was drawing to a close as European powers reasserted control over their colonies. In September of 1704, the vengeful serpent was spotted by HMS Redoubtable, a fourth-rate ship of the line with 40 guns, and a captain named Thomas Harrington, who had made his reputation hunting pirates off the African coast. The British warship was slower than Blackwood's brigantine, but more heavily armed, and Harrington proved to be a skilled tactician who anticipated Blackwood's maneuvers. The chase lasted 3 days across open ocean. Blackwood used every trick he knew, doubling back at night, using squalls for cover, jettisoning weight to gain speed. But Harrington was relentless and methodical, slowly closing the distance. On the 3rd day, with the Redoubtable barely a mile behind and gaining, Reed came to Blackwood with news that their powder stores were running dangerously low. They could not fight a prolonged battle. "Then we'll make our stand in the islands," Blackwood decided, "where reefs and shallow water favor our smaller ship." They led Harrington into the Cayos Mosquitos, a maze of small islands and treacherous reefs off the coast of Nicaragua. The vengeful serpent threaded through channels that would tear the bottom from a ship of the line, always staying just ahead of the British guns. But Harrington proved more daring than expected, risking his ship to maintain pursuit, and finally cornered Blackwood's brigantine in a narrow bay with only one exit. The battle was savage and brief. The Redoutable's superior firepower shredded the vengeful Serpent's rigging and holed her hull in multiple places. Blackwood's return fire scored hits but could not penetrate the British warship's heavier timbers. When it became clear the fight was lost, Blackwood gave the order that every captain dreads: abandon ship. His crew took to the boats and rowed desperately for the nearest island, while the Redoutable continued firing on the sinking brigantine. Blackwood was the last to leave, standing on the tilting deck of his dying ship with the British cannons roaring around him. At the final moment, he dove into the warm Caribbean water and swam for shore while the vengeful Serpent settled into her grave. They made it to a small island that was little more than sand and palm trees. Harrington's boats followed, and the British Marines landed with fixed bayonets to take prisoners. The pirate crew scattered into the sparse jungle, but there was nowhere to go. One by one they were captured, until only Blackwood and Reed remained free, hiding in a cave on the island's southern shore. "We can't stay here," Reed said. "They'll find us by morning." Blackwood said nothing. He was calculating possibilities, running through scenarios, trying to find the tactical solution that would save them. But for the first time in his career, there was no clever maneuver, no hidden advantage to exploit. They were hunted animals on a tiny island surrounded by the British Navy. "There is one option," Blackwood said finally. "I still have my commission from Spain, my letters of marque. They're sewn into the lining of my coat. If I surrender to Harrington and prove I was acting as a Spanish privateer, not a pirate, they might transport me to England for diplomatic negotiations rather than hanging me here." "And what about the rest of us? Your crew who followed your orders? They hang as pirates. I cannot save them." Blackwood's voice was flat, emotionless. "But I can save myself, and perhaps, with Spanish diplomatic intervention, eventually gain freedom." Reed stared at his captain, the man he had followed for years, whose secrets he had kept, whose double life he had enabled. "You would abandon us. After everything. I would survive, as I always have, by whatever means necessary." But before Blackwood could act on this plan, the cave entrance darkened with red-coated Marines. They had been found. The British soldiers seized both men, binding their hands and marching them down to the beach, where the rest of the captured crew waited under guard. Captain Harrington came ashore personally to inspect his prizes. He was a younger man than Blackwood, perhaps 35, with the confident bearing of an officer who had never known significant failure. He walked down the line of prisoners, assessing each one until he reached Blackwood. "Captain Erasmus Blackwood," Harrington said, "your reputation precedes you. Do you have any final words before we begin the proceedings?" Blackwood met his captor's eyes and made his final gambit. "I claim diplomatic immunity under the Articles of War. I am not a pirate. I am a privateer commissioned by the Kingdom of Spain. Operating under legitimate letters of marque, I demand to be treated as a prisoner of war, not a criminal." Harrington's expression showed genuine surprise. "You claim to serve Spain?" A curious assertion from an Englishman commanding a crew of international bandits. "The documents are sewn into my coat lining. Examine them. They bear the Viceroy's seal and the authorization of the Council of the Indies." The British captain ordered Blackwood's coat removed and inspected. Sure enough, the lining concealed carefully preserved documents. The commission, the letters of marque, correspondence from Spanish officials. Harrington read through them with an expression that cycled from skepticism to shock to cold fury. "These appear genuine," he admitted finally. "If true, this complicates matters considerably. You understand what you're confessing to, that you, an Englishman, served Spain against English interests. That is treason, Captain Blackwood, a hanging offence under English law, whereas piracy might have earned you simple execution." I understand perfectly. And I also understand that Spain will demand my return through diplomatic channels. The Council of the Indies does not abandon its agents, particularly those who hold sensitive information. Harrington studied this complex prisoner and saw the trap closing around him. If Blackwood was genuinely a Spanish agent, then executing him would create an international incident during a time when England sought peace with Spain. But if he transported Blackwood to England and the documents proved false or expired, he would have wasted months in diplomatic negotiations only to eventually hang the man anyway. "Your crew will still hang as pirates," Harrington said finally. "The British Admiralty has no interest in their diplomatic status." Blackwood turned to look at Reed and the others, the men who had followed him into battle, who had trusted his judgment, who had kept his secrets. In Reed's eyes, he saw not anger, but a terrible understanding. The quartermaster had always known that Blackwood would choose survival over loyalty when the moment came. "They were following my orders as commissioned privateers," Blackwood tried. "They should be treated as prisoners of war as well. They sailed under a pirate's flag and attacked ships of many nations. Their actions speak louder than any belated claims of legitimacy. You, Captain, may have your political protections. They do not." The executions took place the next morning on the beach. Gallows were constructed from ship's timber and palm trunks, and the surviving crew of the Vengeful Serpent was hanged in groups of 5, while Blackwood watched from where he sat bound against a tree. Reed was in the last group. Before the noose tightened around his neck, he called out to his former captain, "I hope your survival is worth the weight of this memory." Then the platform dropped, and Reed died with the others, swinging in the Caribbean wind while seabirds circled overhead and the gentle waves lapped at the white sand beach. 38 men died that day, and Blackwood watched every death with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Harrington transported his lone surviving prisoner to Kingston, Jamaica, where British colonial officials spent months in correspondence with their Spanish counterparts trying to resolve Blackwood's status. The documents proved genuine. He had indeed been commissioned as a Spanish privateer. But the war had ended, the commission had technically expired, and his recent attacks on Spanish shipping as a true pirate complicated his claims to protection. During his imprisonment, Blackwood learned that Don Alfonso had died of fever, and that most of the Spanish officials who had known about his arrangement had either been reassigned or had conveniently forgotten their involvement. Spain made diplomatic protests about his capture, but lacked the will to push the matter to crisis. England wanted peace more than it wanted one traitor's execution. The compromise reached satisfied no one. Blackwood would not hang, but he would never be free. He was transferred to a prison hulk, moored permanently in Kingston Harbour, where former pirates and privateers lived out their days in chains, too politically complicated to execute, but too dangerous to release. He spent his remaining years in the ship's hold, watching through a porthole as other vessels came and went from the harbour. Trading ships, navy vessels, even the occasional pirate hunter, bringing in new prisoners. Sometimes other inmates would ask him to tell stories of his legendary career, of the battles he had won and the treasure he had accumulated. Blackwood would smile and weave tales that mixed truth and fiction, until even he could not remember which parts were real. He never mentioned his Spanish commission or the secret allegiances that had defined his life. Let them believe he had been simply a pirate, feared by all, master of his fate. The truth, that he had been a pawn in games played by distant powers, that his feared reputation had been mostly manufactured for political purposes, was too humiliating to share. He died in 1719, aged 53, from a fever that swept through the prison hulk during the summer heat. They buried him in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery on the outskirts of Kingston. No monument marked his passing. No records documented his service to Spain. The treasure caches he had hidden throughout the Caribbean remained undiscovered, slowly corroding in their hiding places. But in the Spanish archives in Seville, tucked among thousands of documents concerning colonial administration, there exists a letter from the Viceroy of New Spain, dated July 1705. It acknowledges the service of an unnamed English privateer who had successfully eliminated several French pirate operations in the Caribbean, and it authorizes a payment of 10,000 Spanish reals to be held in trust pending the agent's release from British custody. The payment was never claimed, and the trust was eventually absorbed back into the colonial treasury. On the island where Blackwood's crew was executed, local fishermen sometimes find artifacts in the sand: rusted cutlass blades, fragments of British uniform buttons, pieces of rope that might have been nooses. They tell stories about the pirate captain who betrayed his men to save himself, though the details have mutated through generations of retelling. Some versions claim he was actually a Spanish nobleman conducting a secret mission. Others say he was cursed by his dying crew and that his ghost still walks the beach at night, searching for the loyalty he betrayed. The truth, as always, is more complicated and less satisfying than legend. Captain Erasmus Blackwood was a man who served multiple masters, trusted none of them, and discovered too late that survival without honor is its own form of death. His reputation as the pirate everyone feared was both earned and artificial. Real violence in service of manufactured identity, genuine tactical brilliance deployed for purposes he never fully controlled. In the end, those who feared him most never knew the truth. The Brotherhood of the Coast remembered him as one of the most feared pirates of the age, a man who took what he wanted and bowed to no authority. They never learned that their feared predator had been a Spanish dog all along, carefully selecting targets based on intelligence from colonial governors, eliminating specific rivals to protect treasure routes he would never personally threaten. And perhaps that is the final irony of Blackwood's life. His greatest deception was so successful that even his betrayal could not fully unmask it. The legend of the fearsome pirate survived his confession, his imprisonment, and his death. Ship's captains still told stories about him decades later, using his name to frighten sailors into vigilance. Parents in port towns warned children that Captain Blackwood would come for them if they misbehaved. The truth died with him in that Kingston prison hulk, buried as completely as the treasure he never retrieved, and somewhere in a cave or a buried chest or a crevice in coral reef, his secret caches still wait, gold and silver and gems that were stolen in service of Spain, but which Spain never bothered to claim, wealth that will likely remain hidden until the ocean swallows it completely or time turns it into dust. On his final night alive, delirious with fever, Blackwood reportedly muttered about maps and coordinates, about Reed's last words, about the weight of watching men die for secrets they never knew they were keeping. The prison guard who heard these ramblings wrote them in his log, adding a notation that the old pirate had gone mad at the end, speaking nonsense about serving Spain and protecting treasure routes. No one believed him. They never did.